So I think we can start just to respect the folks' time, and it's exciting to be here with many of you, some old and new friends here. My name is Kevin Ahern. I'm a professor at Manhattan University, where I direct a Dorothy Day Center there. I also have the honor and privilege of chairing the Guild for Dorothy's canonization. This is an exciting topic for us to discuss this evening on Dorothy Day and Pope Francis, but also knowing that we have a new Holy Father and a new potentially new links for us to discuss in a few months' time or a few years' time of Dorothy's impact with this first American Pope that we have here. This is the fifth of these roundtable webinars that we have done. Gratitude especially to Casey Mullaney, our program coordinator for the Guild, who has set a lot of this up for us and does outstanding work. If you're not on our listserv for the Guild, we have these monthly missives that give a sort of a round table of what's happening in the world about Dorothy and all the amazing, exciting things that are going on about this woman who many of us, I think, deeply appreciate. So please feel free to sign up for that. Please also a plug, you're welcome to join if you're not already a member of the Dorothy Day Guild. And to find out more links to our previous webinars, you can see on the DorothyDayGuild.org website. Thanks also to Manhattan University for helping us to host this webinar, and to our speakers here this evening. We have some great folks here that we're going to hear from. And one of the things we like to do with these spaces is to have interactive, intergenerational spaces, and to really make use of this platform of Zoom for dialogue, and to make sure we'll leave room towards at the end for folks to chime in, or folks to also ask some questions for our amazing panelists here. But we like to also give the floor and allow one of the first voices on these webinars to be an undergraduate student. I want to pass the floor to Gus. And Gus, you can maybe just introduce yourself, and then you'll introduce the panel. So Gus, please.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Gus. I am a occasional volunteer at the South Bend Catholic Worker. Uh, I go to undergrad at Earlham College, which is probably it's a small Quaker college that you have never heard of. Um, but yeah, I don't want to say too much about myself because I'm very excited for this discussion and would Robert Ellsberg, who is the publisher of Orbis Books and the editor of 6 volumes of writings by Dorothy Day. He has just edited I Am a Mission on This Earth, Selected Writings by Pope Francis. Margaret Pfeil, who is a co-founder of the St. Peter Claver Catholic Worker, Our Lady of the Road, and New Day Intake Center. She also holds a joint appointment in the Theology Department and Institute for Social Concerns at the University of Notre Dame. Deirdre Cornell, who is a senior editor of Marinal and Misioneros magazines. She has been involved for 3 decades in community-based ministry in New York's Hudson River Valley. Magdalena Muñoz Pizzulic, originally from Chile, who is a Catholic worker at the St. Peter Claver community. She is a moral theologian and social scientist, currently working on housing justice. She has also been translating some of Dorothy Day's works into Spanish.
Great. Thank you, Gus. And I think of a lot of webinars, probably the folks on this one will have been more likely to have heard of a small Quaker college than some other places. So we're super excited to have you here and to see you again. So we have a few rounds of questions. So we'll allow the panelists to answer them, and we'll then go to one by one to try to encourage in this platform as much dialogue as possible. And so maybe I'll start with this one. I was teaching a class this semester where it was focused largely on Dorothy and Pope Francis. And at the final exam, which I graded, and students did okay. They had to answer the question, right, to compare and contrast Dorothy and Pope Francis and their styles of social Catholicism. So I wonder, maybe we'll start with Robert and then circle down after. What points of convergence or divergence do you see in these two remarkable Catholics of our time?
I see the areas of convergence much more vividly than I do the divergence. In fact, I would say that Pope Francis was kind of the dream pope of Dorothy Day. She respected all popes, but the idea of a pope who took his name from Saint Francis and truly tried to live up to the challenge implied in that, in his call for a church for the poor, uh, who spoke out, with such compassion for migrants and those on the margins, who called for a church that was evangelizing and going out to the margins and peripheries rather than being enclosed in its own self-protective bubble. So, I think that you could go through almost all of the themes that Pope Francis, championed, whether his strong, outspoken words about war, his defense of migrants and refugees, his concern for ecology and care for the earth, and basically his elevating the kind of image of Jesus and the Beatitudes as the center reference point for the church rather than the catechism. As far as divergences, I would say, well, they occupied very different offices or roles. She, as a layperson, I think represented that as a kind of lay holiness, and I think that Pope Francis represented the kind of holiness of leadership, both as a moral voice within the church, but also as a standard of moral values within the world at a time when we are seeing rising authoritarianism, when we're seeing Christian nationalism and the exploitation of religion for nationalist purposes, and where we're seeing what Pope Francis called a culture of indifference. Um, I think that he was a pastor rather than a theologian, which is a departure from recent popes we've had. But I think it was her kind of a dream of a pope who washed the feet of prisoners, who gave up the kind of trappings of clericalism as much as he could, and called for other shepherds to be have the smell of the sheep. So that's what I would say to that.
Great. Margaret?
Yes. Hi, everyone. Good evening. Well, I would agree with what Robert just shared. When I think about points of convergence, the first thing that really comes to mind is what Pope Francis called integral ecology, connecting the economic, social, and ecological. And Dorothy wrote about connecting and celebrating the material creation through a sacramental lens and understanding the interconnection of all of creation in the way that Pope Francis articulated in Laudato Si. Pope Francis's commitment in many ways, but especially in his 2017 World Day of Peace message to nonviolence, and as Robert said, citing the Beatitudes as a kind of field manual would have really resonated with Dorothy. I guess if I press to find a divergence, I do think Dorothy exercised as a layperson a prophetic voice in a different way, challenging institutions like the state, critiquing Holy Mother State and the war economy in a way that perhaps as Pope Francis was more limited in doing. But probably would have agreed with her if he had been free to do so. Yeah, and then there are other questions later, so I won't say more now.
Great. Thank you, Deirdre.
Thank you. Hello to everyone. Well, I jotted down a lot of areas of convergence, which is not surprising, is it? Number one was travel. They both traveled a lot as leaders of far-flung families, keeping people in touch with each other and keeping in touch with them. Next, I wrote down a joy in vocation. I think that each of them, in their own journeys, in their own faith journeys, experienced God, turned to God with joy, of course, joy of the gospel being the first apostolic exhortation that Pope Francis gave us. But it makes me think of Dorothy with her turning toward God with the joy of having her daughter. So this sense of joy and the link between joy and vocation. I think they both had a great gift for communication. They both were able to come across in a very accessible way, a very intimate way that really, I think, reached people at a fundamental level. Simple lifestyle, I think we all know about the commitment that they each had to a simplicity of lifestyle, commitment to peace, commitment to care for creation, as Margie has mentioned. Something that I see in both of them is an ability to both love humanity in groups and humanity as individual people. There's a sense of Dorothy identifying with the workers, identifying with the civil rights movement, identifying with the farm workers, and Pope Francis as well. But then there's also that sense that each one of them had of being able to connect with individual people. And I think of this is a funny story, but I think of Dorothy in Kings County Hospital during the Spanish flu, and she writes about how she was taking care of a woman, and this indigent poor woman, she wanted her wig. And the nurses are saying, you can't have your wig. You can't have that here. This is a hospital. You can't have that. And Dorothy's saying, well, she's a human being and she deserves to have a wig if she wants to have a wig. You know, it's that sense of, I don't want to say personalism because it's not exactly philosophical, but personhood, really respecting personhood. If I could come back later, I'd love to address the question of fervor. I find that they share a certain openness to fervor that I find very remarkable and a lot, I think, in common. But just to end my participation at this moment, I would say a notable divergence is their backgrounds in the sense that when you read Pope Francis's autobiography, which came out just this January, he says, I come from a people. To understand me, you have to understand my people. And he communicates that deep rootedness in his family and in his immigrant community, his Italian, Argentinian community in Buenos Aires, and how they struggled, but how tight-knit that community was. And of course, a predominantly Catholic country and very practicing setting. And then joining the Jesuits and having that community already, a community of faith. And there's one sentence I just love in that book. It's when Pope Francis is ordained. He writes, Nonna Rosa, his grandmother, was radiant. Nonna Rosa was radiant. Just this, again, joy, but a joy that was shared in his vocation, in his family, and in his community from the very beginning. And I feel that Dorothy really, she had to fumble. She had to find her way. At times, I think she felt more alone. She, of course, was very close to her siblings, but her family did not give her that sense of rootedness in terms of faith, especially. And when she was baptized, she lost her radical community in a sense. So I see that that's a real difference. And that perhaps she found her community in the saints and in the liturgy and in the writers of the church. And then she found her community in the Catholic worker. So I'd say that for me, that's a notable difference.
Thank you. Magda.
Hey, everybody. Thank you for the invitation. Well, I think that a lot has been said already, but I would say that the motivations are the same, and when they put their focus is the same, which are the poor, and also all beyond are suffering, which is not only the poor, but also like not only material poverty, it's also our planet, it's also women, it's also all the people that are suffering the consequences of war. And I would say that the focus is the same, and another coincidence that, at least for me, is really important is the role that they give to voluntary poverty. I was very surprised now that Pope Francis died, how many pictures are going around of how his room was and all the gifts that he received as a pope and everything that he donated, and that he had, like, I don't know, $100 in his account. And I think that this presents something like understanding voluntary poverty as something that is not absolute and that is something that we can still live today. And I think that it is something in common that really shocks me. Like, both understand voluntary poverty as the way to actually serve the poor. Now, on the differences, I do find some, as Deirdre said, I think that the context where both were raised and formed, and where they both saw Jesus face to face, was completely different. And I would say that that will give you obviously different perspectives. Pope Francis is not a liberation theologian, but he's a theologian of the people, which is like the Argentinian landing of liberation theology. So for him, the culture is extremely important, and everything that is grown in community. And that's what I think, that he would have a perspective of community and state. Like, the state is part of, like, the reflection of that community. So it's not that he would be kind of against to the idea of a state, but he would be very critical with it, especially with politics. I would say that his role of that was more evident while he was an archbishop in Buenos Aires. He was pretty well known by his speeches and how he would refer to the president and the Congress and all that. I think that that changed a little bit when he became Pope, precisely because you can't have such a clear perspective of what is happening on every different country. But we can see that around when he was traveling around, he would always had something to say about the local situation and what was going on with the people of every country. So I think that that is a difference. Basically, this idea of the community and the people, I think that shapes how you think that transformation should go. And I would say that Dorothy goes in a way more internal or personal transformation. Like, if I change and I have my own transformation, then I can make a change in the world. But I think that Pope Francis also had this idea of a communal transformation, of giving voice to the ones that never have been heard, you know, like these transformations that comes like from the ground. So I would say that even though both were aiming to the same, I think that their background, their theological background, made a difference on how transformation should happen.
Great, thank you. So maybe for a slightly more challenging question, and we'll go in reverse order this time. In about almost a decade ago, right? It's in the fall we're going to commemorate Pope Francis's visit to the United States, which coincided with his visit to Cuba, to the United States, to the UN, and he had that unprecedented experience of addressing a joint session of Congress. I think many of us will remember that. And he uplifted four great model Americans, including Dorothy Day. Our friend and colleague Julie Leninger-Pizzulic has a book where she talks about Thomas Merton and Dorothy Day, which is Thomas Merton and the Greatest Dorothy Day, Thomas Merton and the Greatest Commandment, where she details a little bit about the background of that speech. But I'm wondering, as we think over the past decade, after Pope Francis uplifted these four great Americans, Merton, Dorothy, Abraham Lincoln, Martin Luther King Jr., and talked about how a country could only be great if they practiced social justice like Dorothy did, right? How might we assess the impact of that speech, and maybe the impact of Francis more broadly on the U.S. Church, right? How might you assess this? And we'll begin, Magda, recognizing that this you weren't here, I don't think, in
Yeah.
2015. So yeah.
I've been here just for 3 years, so I can't say anything about that. I can I can only say that it surprised me how much of an impact was Pope Francis' death, even here in the US, which I think that it speaks on how a good leader can reach out to many people, even the ones that are not that don't believe in God or that participate in different confessions. But I honestly don't feel prepared to answer something like that. So I'll pass it to Deirdre.
Thank you. Well, I think that it definitely helped the cause. I think that having Dorothy's name put in that context gave a level of credibility to the cause for canonization. So I think that that is very notable. In terms of the wider church at the parish level, I don't know how much has reached the church in terms of um, the level of participation that we would like to see. I can share though that in my own community, and this is not directly related to 2015, but I just would like to share that in 2003, in the community where my husband and I work, which is an immigrant community here in the Hudson Valley, working people. In 2003, in a church basement, we would just get people together, get leaders together, and I had proposed to them, let's look at 2003, Strangers No Longer. It's a joint letter that was written by the Mexican and U.S. bishops on immigration. And they said to me, well, when the bishops send us priests who are going to really care for us and really be with us and share our hardships, then maybe we'll read something like that. Well, in 2013, the same people wanted to talk about Pope Francis. And it wasn't just because he was Latin American, it was because he knew about the smell of the sheep, that was the criterion for being a good leader. So I think that Pope Francis's influence has been just tremendous. Now, in terms of linking Dorothy with Francis, I think that in 2015, that was quite unexpected. I mean, I don't, and I think Robert and Margie could perhaps address this better than I, but my sense is that that was really surprising that he would lift Dorothy up in that way. And just remarkable because there's that sense again of they're sharing such their vision of what the church should be and the kind of accompaniment that the church gives and the priority of Catholic social teaching that makes Catholics get our hands dirty, that makes us go to the peripheries. That kind of convergence between their visions, I think, was so significant that was what he wanted to really underline in that address to Congress, which again, from my view, is just quite surprising. So I think, again, it was excellent for the cause, made a lot of US bishops pay attention in a way that perhaps they hadn't before, and helped us along in that way.
Thanks, Magda and Deirdre. When I think about that speech, the first two things that come to mind are his attention to capital punishment and to nuclear disarmament. And thinking about what's happened in the 10 years since then, I do notice just anecdotally among my students that there is greater awareness about information of conscience around capital punishment, and particularly with the revision to the catechism. I think that's very significant, and I think he laid the groundwork in his address to Congress, which is especially important, of course, in the US context, where we continue to practice capital punishment. And he knew that quite well. He knew his audience. The other issue that comes to mind is nuclear disarmament. And I was part of a conference at the Vatican on imagining a world without nuclear weapons. And Pope Francis gave a talk in which he condemned not only the use of nuclear weapons, but the possession of nuclear weapons. And I was sitting with another moral theologian, a friend, with whom I was in graduate school, and we looked at each other and said, did he really just say that? And then we thought, oh my goodness, imagine the work that we have to do in terms of formation of conscience, because most US Catholics are not thinking about nuclear weapons generally. And so getting people to think about it and then to think, okay, not only the use, but the possession is condemned. What's required then of this country, and what's required of US Catholics to respond? That experience led to a conference at Georgetown that Drew Christensen organized with a colleague here at Notre Dame, Jerry Powers. And out of that came a book called Forbidden, which Georgetown University Press published after Drew's death. And that volume, I think, is a tribute to Pope Francis pushing the conversation in a way that the US Church needed. I don't think we would have even come to the point of continuing that discussion, because generally the discussion has devolved into a sort of realpolitik understanding, well, we're not going to get rid of them. But I think his address to Congress opened the way for not only moral theologians, but others in the church to say, no, we need to have a pastoral and theological conversation about this that then translates into action. So I remain hopeful about that, even in the conditions of our world where it's become even more dangerous with regard to the possibility of nuclear war and nuclear accidents.
I remember the speech very vividly, and almost kind of falling off my seat when Dorothy and Thomas Merton were among the four people around which he organized his speech. And it is a speech that I've gone back to many, many times, because not just because he held up Dorothy Day, but because it was such a prophetic warning or message to America, the United States, that is. This is 2015, so this is a year before Trump was elected. And you can see him laying out a kind of moral agenda in which he connected some of these religious figures with the kind of deep resources of American culture and history, you might say the better angels of American history. Abraham Lincoln, Martin Luther King, Dorothy Day, and Thomas Merton. And he didn't just focus on Dorothy Day and her social justice. The speech was really organized around four different dreams embodied by these different people: a dream of freedom, a dream of equality, a dream of social justice and peace, and a dream of dialogue. And he said a country can be considered great to the extent that it embodies these dreams or lives up to fulfills these dreams. A year before, making America great again, it took on a different kind of resonance. And you could go back, a couple years later and look at that speech and say, oh my God, it's like, did he see what was coming? In any case, I feel that it would be very hard to say that America or the American church, where a majority of Catholics have twice now voted for Donald Trump, in repudiation of every single one of those dreams, as far as I can tell, that the speech itself, left an impact. I think that there you can point to as Margie did, that issues like capital punishment, concern for peace, nuclear weapons, and I would say especially climate and ecology, where his strong position made it possible for people who had been sort of on the fringe, so to speak, to say, no, we're totally rooted in the official teaching of the church, and that gives us a little bit of wind in our sails. But by and large, the church establishment in this country, and therefore access to average Catholics in the pews, Francis's social message was utterly filtered out. And I would say from that, because as Americans, we tend to think that American church or America is like the center of the church or the world or something like that, that Pope Francis's mission on this earth was not really for the United States. Clearly not, if he was, utter failure. But for those on the margins and the peripheries, existential and geographic. His importance for people in Africa and war-torn areas there, in the Middle East, in Asia, in far-flung, places that had almost never seen a bishop, much less a pope, Mongolia and Kazakhstan and places like that. His kind of real emphasis on the global church, and that the primary, mission of the church in the world is to bear the good news for the poor. I think that Dorothy, the Catholic worker and the cause of Dorothy, not just the Catholic worker, represents, a kind of rearguard action or movement to emphasize and bring forward those kind of values. Now, one of his signature issues was migrants and refugees, which is also a signature issue of the current administration, but with diametrically, and I would say diabolically, contrasting approaches. I would say that Francis, his message still stands out there, waves it as a banner of what the church could be if it really heeded the gospel. And the future that is now with a different pope, with an American pope. We'll get to that subject as well. But I guess that's still go back and read that actual speech. We all remember the part about Dorothy Day, but the whole thing about talking about the blood-soaked arms industry, capital punishment, prejudice against immigrants, etc. It's absolutely important in one of his signature statements, I think.
Excellent. Thank you. One of the last big things that Pope Francis did was to initiate this Jubilee year of hope. And many, of course, will remember some of the dramatic symbolic elements that Francis did with this year. Casey and I had the chance to talk at a Friday night meeting down at Mary House ahead of a symposium that several of you on this call were part of a few weeks ago. But I wonder for the panelists, right? How do you connect this idea of hope, or maybe pilgrims of hope, or Jubilee with these two amazing figures, right? So maybe we can start with Robert and weave our way back down again.
Well, that's actually an area in which I would point to similarities between them, because both of them kind of took a leaf from Therese of Lisieux in The Little Way. This idea of the significance of things that appear insignificant, the victories that are won by apparent defeat, the power of small gestures and planting seeds. Pope Francis, one of his maxims was time is more powerful than space. That is to say, what's important is initiating processes. And Dorothy's, statement also that what our job is to do is to plant seeds. We are not here for the harvest, and we may never see the results of our actions. But just as Jesus multiplied the loaves and fishes, or the seed that dies and falls into the ground and brings forth great fruit, or the tiny mustard seed, those are the kind of mustard seed kind of hope is, I think, what both Francis and Dorothy believed in. And I think that they both believed that hope, is not just optimism that everything's going to turn out all right. It's a paschal hope that goes right through the cross as something as horrible as it can be. But they believed that hope has to be commensurate with our hopeful actions and our hopeful prayers. And we can't just sit back and say, well, I hope it's all going to turn out all right, if we're not doing anything about it, if we're not putting our full intention spiritually and physically in that direction. And Dorothy, life, you could say, entire life was spent in doing something about the problems in the world, and not just hoping that they would all turn out all right. And Pope Francis too, I think, used every day, every hour of his papacy to plant seeds of hope, and we'll only be able to judge in the future.
Thank you, Robert. When I think about Dorothy and this Jubilee Year of Hope, I think about gritty eschatological hope rooted in love. And I think of her prayer practices of engaging with the saints and the communion of saints as a source of hope herself in the midst of darkness. As you said, Robert, a paschal hope. And I think, especially this year in these times, I have myself taken hope from that, from the fact of the Jubilee year. I think that's the last parting gift that Pope Francis gave us, was this Jubilee year of hope in the midst of so much darkness. And with Dorothy, invoking our companions in the communion of saints to walk alongside us and to be able to persevere and discern well, what is it that is being asked of us in this particular moment? That's an expression of God's love at work in the world. And it's the love of Jesus risen and walking beside us, like on the road to Emmaus. And I think Dorothy held on to that deeply. There's the image of her identifying small patches of beauty in the midst of really tough circumstances resonates with me. I think, especially after a long, cold winter here in South Bend, with all the turmoil around us, taking delight in the new trees that Casey single-handedly arranged to be planted on something like over 20 trees have been planted in the last 2 weeks on our street. And to walk out and see these little dogwoods every day. And it's something beyond us that I think both Dorothy and Pope Francis could perceive, that is God's goodness calling us forth. And as Peter Martin said, creating a new society in the shell of the old, and a place where it's easier for people to be good, and not giving up on that hope. So, yeah, thank you. It's a wonderful question.
Thank you. That was beautiful. I came across this quote from Jim Forrest, which was one of the things that drew him and kept him coming back to Dorothy, was that she had the ability to see not only what is wrong in the world, but to see beauty and to discern signs of hope. And those signs of hope, as Pope Francis was pointing out in the Bull of Indiction for the Jubilee year, the Spes non confundit, signs of hope in work for peace, in young people, in the struggle of migrants. I found that he was pinpointing so many issues or groups of people where Dorothy herself had been either expressing concern or had been working on behalf of those people. So I found a lot of convergence in the signs of hope that Pope Francis gives us, and thinking about how young people were drawn to her because she exuded this enthusiasm for life and this sense of hope. At the same time, not, as we've said, not closing her eyes to the injustices that she clearly was aware of. And as Jim was pointing out in this quote, seeing what was wrong, but still finding that hope and being able to then transmit that to other people.
Well, I agree with how both gave youth such an important role in terms of like letting young people know that they are capable of changing and doing important things. Like I think that both trusted a lot on young folks, and I think that that is really important. But I also where I see more hope is on how open to dialogue and building bridges they both were. Dorothy usually went back to her relation and friendships with members of the Communist Party and many other political folks that were more involved in politics and were atheists, but they would be able to discuss and find solutions together. And I think that Pope Francis really did precisely like exactly the same. He would call back to the church or in dialogue to so many different people from so many different beliefs. I think that that is also why he has been like he was so respected, and also why there was a huge spectrum of people that were really sad when he died. It's because he gave a voice to the scientific community, to the immigrants, to the poor, to everybody who had something to say that would help us to have a better community, you know. And I think that this ability of building bridges and like inviting others with their ideas and with their own beliefs, but for a common project, it is so important, and it's such a light of hope. And I think that his pontificate really helped many people to understand that there is a huge part of the Catholic Church that really desires for the world to be a better place for everybody, and that the only way to accomplish that is working together despite our differences. And yeah, I think that this new vision that he offered, this openness to difference and diversity, is a real light of hope for everybody.
And of course, I think we can recall and celebrate the life of Francis, this amazing pilgrim himself, and calling this pilgrimage year. And I think of all the people coming into St. Peter's on a type of pilgrimage to his body, but how reflective that is of Dorothy's own life of pilgrimage, and their journeys, as you all have said. And you know, we many of us in the guild were hopeful that Francis might be the one to declare Dorothy venerable, but now we might be looking to a new pope that might do this. With this extraordinary news that we have a American pope, even though some people described him as the least American of the Americans. But of course, we recognize the use of American here is referring to the United States. Pope Francis was the first American pope, just coming from a different part of the Americas. Like to make sure we clarify that. But so, you know, Pope Francis or Pope Leo, right, coming from Chicago, where Dorothy, a city that marked Dorothy, right, coming and choosing the name Leo after Leo the 13th. So I wonder, you know, what is your reaction? Starting with you, Magda. What was your reaction in hearing this news? And then what? You know, yeah, like what do you make of this, and what hopes do you even bring to this new papacy?
Well, I have to say that I'm very pleased of the new Peruvian Pope. I think that it was wonderful news for the church. Honestly, I was more than hopeful. I was scared before the results. I was just scared that this would be like a very different pontificate of somebody that wouldn't put the poor at the very center. So I was scared. We were at Our Lady of the Road, where we offer hospitality for a lot of folks, and we were with Casey, and Emma comes devastated, saying like it's American, it's American, and I was like, no, but wait, and my mom sent me a text right away saying he was like in Peru for 40 years. And I said, oh no, I remember the good American. This is the one. This is the one. So after that, we were all more relaxed. And when he interrupted his speech to send some greetings to his community in Peru, I really loved that because Chiclayo is like a very humble, poor community. And the fact that he really broke the protocol to speak to them in a language that he was sure they would understand. I would say that it only like shows how nice and how concerned is he will also be about the margins and about the people, the poor people. Basically, I like the fact that he's from Chicago, but I insist that most of his religious life and religious experience has been in Latin America and with the poor people in Peru. And I think that that will give him a very different perspective. Also, because it is funny that he's sharing citizenship now in a time that migration is such a topic for all of us. He was very close to Francis, but also they have a lot of differences. So I don't know. I'm hopeful. I think that his experience, not only in Peru but also around the world, because he was the one helping Pope Francis to pick the bishops and cardinals. I think that that would also give him a very different perspective, more like maybe global perspective. I think that he's probably more aware of the differences, the cultural differences in the church. And I think that that is also sometimes necessary. I feel that sometimes when we have a very close idea, we think that the progress should go just in one way, and we oversee the cultural impact that that could have for different communities. So I'm very hopeful, but I know that it's also going to be different. So yeah.
That was very well said, Magdalena. Thank you. Well, we were all just shocked because I think the common wisdom had been that there would not be a US Pope. There's even that quote from, I guess, Cardinal George, Bishop Barron's was quoting Cardinal George saying that there would never be a US Pope while the US was a world power, something along those lines. So there's a quote that you can look up later. Quite surprising, actually quite shocking. And I'm just thrilled, absolutely thrilled. We're really happy. The first thing that I did was when I realized it was an Augustinian, I called our dear family friend who, as a seminarian, had spent summers with us at our Catholic Worker House of Hospitality in Waterbury, Connecticut, because CTU students, Catholic theological students, used to come and spend time at the House of Hospitality as part of their seminary trainings. And so this friend of ours had been in seminary with Robert Prevost and thought very, very highly of him, and said that, so he had known him since the early 80s. And he said that when Father Prevost went to Peru, he came back transformed. That the missionary experience just really was what made him come into his own as a priest, if that makes sense. He just, at heart, became a missionary. And that experience, this friend, our Augustinian friend, having known him over the decades and seeing that on the visits when he would come back, when the now Pope would come back to the US. So seeing that transformative process, and really, I think, understanding, when we heard him speak in Spanish to Chiclayo, to his diocese, and not in English, I think that gave us a sense of how deeply, he became the bishop of that diocese. Those are his people. And then, of course, he naturalized as a Peruvian citizen. Here in New York, we're friends also with a family from Chiclayo who emigrated about 4 years ago. It was just before COVID. And so her children were all confirmed by him in the diocese. It's a very poor diocese. They're from a very poor village. She couldn't say enough about him as a pastor. So I think that we have an excellent administrator, but we also have the heart of a pastor. So that combination of the capability of administering and of having a pastor, I think is tremendous. As Magdalena noted, his familiarity with the dicastery of bishops, that's going to be wonderful for uniting the global church. And for us in the US, I think it remains to be seen. But I'm just overwhelmed, really.
Well, I happened to be at Dominican University in Chicago when the news broke, and yeah, it was special to be in Chicago. It was surreal, really. It was sort of an out of time experience that day. And hearing his name, his choice of name, Leo the 14th, immediately brought to mind Rerum Novarum. And I felt great joy right away when I heard that, because I knew what he was signifying, at least what I thought he was signifying, but he's confirmed since then to retrieve and reinvigorate a vision of social justice for ordinary people, workers around the world, and ask, well, what are the new things of these times? And I think it's telling that he has already addressed AI. He's been addressing war and immigration right out of the gate. I'm very hopeful. I think, especially in our current context in the U.S., to have a U.S. American Pope voicing these things, it feels like a spiritual balm and antidote to the dominant discourse coming from seats of power in our country at the moment. I'll also say, too, here at our Catholic worker, we have a diehard White Sox fan. And when I came back from Dominican, I said, Paul, what do you think? The Pope is a White Sox fan. And he said, oh, we need all the help we can get. So, to have a baseball fan in the Vatican is pretty amazing, especially a White Sox fan.
Well, it's my first reaction was, gosh, I'm old enough now to be Pope. Leo XIV is born just a couple months before I am. It's still going to be exciting to kind of get a sense of what his knowledge is and awareness of the American Catholic scene. We know from some of his tweets that he's a reader of America and NCR, which is good. He could be tweeting other things. We know that he took on J.D. Vance quite directly, and that turned out to be significant because J.D. Vance, you recall, gave these remarks where he's quoted, St. Augustine, this concept. He's a very old concept, he says, Christian concept of the Ordo Amoris, that first you love your family, then you love your neighbors, then you love your community, and then you love your country, and then whatever's left over, for the rest of the world. Which is, no one was better equipped than Robert Prevost to show that was turning Augustine utterly on his head. Everything in Augustine is about ordering your loves, not giving priority to the people closest to you, but ordering everything in relation to God, and that it should, as Pope Francis also responded to that very strongly to the American bishops, using the parable of the Good Samaritan that turns that kind of notion completely on its head. Who is my neighbor? It's not, it's exactly the people that you're deporting from the country so ruthlessly, putting them in concentration camps in El Salvador. Those are your neighbors. But I think that Dorothy would, of course, like Deirdre, and we both work at Maryknoll, and we both light up at the idea of a missionary, and takes seriously Pope Francis's whole idea was to be a community of missionary disciples. That goes, the church has to step outside of its self-referentiality to go out and kind of to the peripheries, margins, to touch the wounds of Christ, or something that Dorothy Day did all the time. But it's also a matter of like what you see. What's your perspective on the world. And for a pope who spent a great deal of his life, and his perspective comes out of his immersion in such a poor community, in a poor country, in a poor continent, the kind of underside of power of this world, is going to undoubtedly have very significant impact. And as has been mentioned, his choice of a name, and his commitment to emphasizing Catholic social teaching. But I'll just say one other thing that connects him, I think, with Dorothy, and that is actually his Augustinian spirituality. That can be used in different ways, as some of us know. Cardinal Dolan likes to call Dorothy an Augustinian figure. By that he means she was a great sinner, and then she became a great saint. Well, I don't think that's really what her story is all about. But I think that both of them, Augustine and Pope Francis also shared this sense of a deep sense of awareness of the presence of God in their own lives. That's the story of Augustine's confessions and how he had been seeking happiness in all different kinds of ways, and realized how kind of self-destructive that was and destructive of other people around him, and finally gives himself over to God and finds the fulfillment of his heart, what his heart was seeking. And Dorothy, her also as he's not a convert, he comes up in a very Catholic milieu, as has been said, but Dorothy as a convert, and writing her own story in 2 memoirs about her conversion, clearly models her story after Augustine's. And the difference between her and Augustine is that he tends to look with scorn at all the sinful things he did in his life and all that kind of thing, whereas Dorothy takes a much more generous view of all the things in her life, both the happy things and the sad things that brought her to the love of God, include particularly those who were committed to the cause of the poor. But Saint Augustine, Dorothy, in a very Augustinian way, could look back on her whole life and could say, even at the times when I was very far from God, the mercy of God, the grace of God was hovering over me, bringing me home. So I think that Dorothy would respond to that aspect of his story.
Wonderful. A lot of really interesting insights that we'll have to see as we go. Let's give some time for the next 15, 20 minutes if folks are willing. If there are time for questions or reactions, I think I wanted to see if Gus, our student, and prioritize the voices of any of the students here. And so maybe Gus, you already introduced yourself, but when people do ask a question, please raise your hand and I'll call on you. And then Gus, and then introduce yourself. But Gus, I heard you had a question.
Yeah, this question may be a little speculative, given how we really don't know that much yet. So I have a backup one if it's yeah. But yeah, my question is just what effect do you think Leo would have on Dorothy's legacy? And also, this may be a question for the moderator too, of what effect would he have on her canonization effort too?
Anyone want to take that?
Gus, he's going to declare her venerable.
We have a good prediction there. Okay, that's a hopeful prediction, right?
Live in hope.
Sell your home, stake everything you own on that.
I don't know if they'll be doing Vegas betting for that for the canonizations like they did for the papacy, but yeah,
I'll clean up.
But on a more serious note, I mean, we could wonder if Pope Leo would be hesitant in a way to canonize, to move along someone from his own country. Pope Francis canonized, I think, 900 Catholics. Is that right? Robert, you would know. It's an amazing number.
That seems like a lot, unless you count all the massive groups of martyrs and stuff.
Right. With all of the
some
groups.
of the most polemic Argentinian martyrs, just because he knew that if he didn't, nobody else would do. So Angelelli and the martyrs of La Rioja were declared by Francis. Also
the Gaucho priest of Argentina that he canonized.
Yeah, so maybe that's something we're going to have to watch out for, right? To see where the canonizations coming from this Pope. What travels does he go to? If he comes to New York, does he, for a UN thing potentially, does he go and visit the Catholic worker? We could maybe push that, right? Or ride on the ferry, or even in other places, right? Does he go to Notre Dame? Maybe, I don't know. But I think we'll have to watch and see. Something also curious to watch: how does he respond to the anniversaries of the bombings in Hiroshima and Nagasaki over the summer? Does he continue on with the movement towards nonviolence as Francis did, or does he maybe try to re-champion just war tradition in a way that might be more consistent with St. Augustine? Those are questions I think we'll have to see as we go in the coming few months. But a few of us are hoping to have the chance to potentially bring the cause to him in Rome in November. So we'll keep up with that. Other questions or comments or feedbacks in this moment of transition, this moment of hope, this moment of new things. Yeah, Marian, please.
I'm going to go back to the similarities between Dorothy Day and Thomas Merton. I mean, Pope Francis. They were both big fans of Dostoevsky. And in fact, the Pope said that Dostoevsky was his life mentor, which is a huge statement for someone who loves fiction. And I wondered if some of the panel would comment on that, because I was trying to think, what was it that struck them both so much? Perhaps the dignity of every human person, especially the poor, the marginalized, the peasant that we find in Dostoevsky. But if anybody has a comment on that, I'd be very interested.
And just, Marion, where are you coming from?
Well, I live in San Diego, but I was a nun for 11 years. I taught in Peru, in Lima. Then I left and married and had children. I'm a grandmother. So I've lived a lot of the Catholic life according to my call. But I'm in San Diego right now, and I'm a writer. I have 2 novels published.
Dorothy always said that you couldn't understand the Catholic worker if you hadn't read Dostoevsky. And I think, that she always was returning to the Crime and Punishment, Brothers Karamazov, the Possessed, Notes from Underground, etc. Was a deeply formative experience for her. I think, not just Dostoevsky was not just a storyteller, but he tells these stories of suffering, sin, and redemption, and the kind of redemption that comes through suffering, and his closeness with the poor, and his depiction of holiness, both in The Idiot and in the Brothers Karamazov. They shared other things in common too. Pope was a great lover, like Dorothy, of opera. Wow. And I think they would have had, just a lot to talk about. I mean, Dorothy's Catholic sort of milieu was really among Italian immigrants, in the Lower East Side, much more than Polish or Irish or something. I think that she would have, they both would have resonated very much with that kind of cultural reference. Of course, both of them great devotion to the Blessed Mother and to the saints and to Saint Francis.
I might say, Dostoevsky's often quoted line, "The world will be saved by beauty." Dorothy frequently picked up on that. And I think where they each found beauty was similar. So, I just am struck by Pope Francis's practice of washing the feet of people who would have been forgotten on a Holy Thursday, or opening a soup kitchen right next to the Vatican. I think these are places where both Dorothy and Pope Francis found beauty because they found Jesus.
Thanks for that great question. Other questions or comments? Jeffrey, and say where you're coming from.
Coming from Boston, and this is kind of going back to your meeting possibly with Dorothy with the new Pope sometime in the future. I've been reading an awful lot of books, and there's so many good ones about Dorothy Day. But one that I'm reading right now, and when I was reading it, it would be really nice to put it into his hands. And it's the one by Dorothy Day, Portraits by Those Who Knew Her, by Rosalie Riegel, because it really shows her humanity and her struggles and her missionary focus through all the things that she's involved in. And it shows the challenges that she was dealing with on a day-to-day basis, not in her own words, which obviously are important too, but as other people saw her, people who saw her day in, day out. You hear about her complaints, you hear about her joys, you hear about the struggles with things like homosexuality, with dealing with people on a day-to-day basis. You hear about her travels, and I think actually a pope would appreciate that. Not so much the great things, but the how she dealt with her struggles. So I was thinking, like, I would send it to him, but it would have never arrived. But you may know people where it could arrive, and I think it's a relatively quick read. It's not gonna and it's just really nice. So that's just a suggestion.
Great. Thank you.
I just point out something that will be of interest, especially to Kevin and Deirdre. Today, I wrote my first of presumably many letters to Pope Leo. A Marinoler is going to Rome and said, could you send me to meet in Rome for me to pick up a couple of Orbis books to give to the Pope? And so I picked two of them. One of them was the book I just edited, Dorothy Day, Spiritual Writings, another Orbis publication like Rosalie's book, but also, wrote him a letter about Orbis and Maryknoll and the books we've done with Pope Francis, and included a copy of the letter that Pope Francis sent to Orbis for our 50th anniversary, hinting it is our 55th anniversary, and be happy to get a blessing for the new Pope too.
Great. Yeah, I think we owe, a lot of us on this call owe a lot to the work of Orbis in publishing things around Dorothy and publishing things around mission and Pope Francis. So we really it's a real gift to the church here. So yeah, other questions or comments or reflections. I had a student in my office today. She's graduating, and she was actually part of a group that went up to Petermore Farm to one of the last groups of students to meet Deirdre's father, Tom, and she read to me the postscript of the long loneliness, right, and the importance of community. And the importance of discovering God in community and Christ in community and the breaking of the bread and in the poor. And it just strikes me here what a beautiful space that we have here together, people from coast to coast, right? In this community space virtually that we're making here. So other thoughts or reactions we can maybe share with folks here, or even if any of the panelists have any reactions to each other.
I really appreciated some things that Deirdre was saying in particular about the kind of personal and background, comparing that between Dorothy. And I also thought of that one of the Pope's favorite words is boldness, parousia, and saying that the church has to display boldness. And I think that's one of the things that you could say about Dorothy, that her spirit of adventure, her audacity, her fearlessness in standing up to powers and going to jail and that sort of thing, that she, I think that's exactly the kind of voice that he thought we should hear more of.
I would like to share just a few words from Pope Francis's last homily. I just came across this for the first time in preparing for this panel, and I had that feeling like the Martin Luther King speech. I have been to the mountaintop. I may not make it with you, but this is just incredible. So this was on Easter Sunday, the 20th of April, of course, the day before he died, his last homily. And he's speaking about Mary Magdalene and Peter and John going to the tomb. And Pope Francis said, "We must set out to look for him in life, look for him in the faces of our brothers and sisters, look for him in everyday business, look for him everywhere except in the tomb. We must look for him without ceasing." That sense of fervor that really, I think Dorothy as well, she had a much more interiorized way. So I believe that this would come out much more in her writing, but it's that similar sense of this deep and personal relationship with Christ. The Pope had gone on to say, "He is alive and with us, shedding the tears of those who suffer and adding to the beauty of life through the small acts of love carried out by each of us. We must hasten to meet Christ. We must run filled with joy. Let us run toward Jesus. Let us rediscover the inestimable grace of being his friends."
Margie, any last comments?
Well, I was just going to say it's beautiful, Deirdre, and that after Pope Francis died that week, I was sharing that with all my classes and just inviting students to read that for themselves. And I think one thing that I'm not sure we've mentioned yet, but I think both Dorothy and Pope Francis had a deep gift for contemplative awareness. And I think it comes through in that passage. I think it's connected to this Jubilee year of hope, that sense of being on the lookout for the risen Jesus in our midst. And, thinking about Laudato Si and Pope Francis's invitation to ecological conversion through a contemplative lens. Dorothy was practicing that day in and day out at the Catholic Worker, connecting action and contemplation in a way that I think keeps all of us going still here, and I'm sure in other Catholic workers.
Magda.
Um, I think that Pope Leo's election was definitely some sort of gift or preparation from Pope Francis. I don't think that this was all just like, I think that there was some intention behind that. And I think that that intention invites us to keep moving and keep going on the mission that we have. I think that both Dorothy and are both people that would see a problem and would try to make their best to solve it, not waiting for whatever order that would come from above. And I think that this is only a call to keep going, like seeing that there's so much hope because there's so much suffering. That many Catholics were really scared about the new Pope because we knew that we could lose a lot. And now that we have the chance to get this mission going, I think that the only way to change this reality is not only changing ourselves, but leaning on each other, finding community, building community.
Wonderful. Well, maybe as a way of closing, and I express my deep gratitude to our panelists for their time this evening, but also for their amazing work that they do for the church and the hope that these folks give me in my effort to try to be a Christian in the world and to be a teacher. And really appreciate spending the time with you all. Maybe we can end just together in a prayer. And we can take a moment to reflect on all those places in the world that need God's love, all those places in the world in need of the Beatitudes, of the works of mercy, the individuals and communities from the Lower East Side to Gaza. We think of all of our dearly departed, especially of Dorothy and Pope Francis. We pray with hope that they are celebrating together as we speak. And I'll end with the last two paragraphs of the prayer written by Pope Francis in his exhortation, Evangelii Gaudium. Virgin of listening and contemplation, Mother of love, bride of the eternal wedding feast, pray for the church whose pure icon you are, that she may never be closed in on herself or lose her passion for establishing God's reign. Star of the new evangelization, help us to bear radiant witness to communion, service, ardent and generous faith, justice and love of the poor, that the joy of the gospel may reach the ends of the earth, illuminating even the fringes of our world. Mother of the living gospel, wellspring of happiness for God's little ones, pray for us. Amen. Alleluia. Thank you all. Have a great, blessed evening. Happy Easter.